Okay, welcome. Today is another deep dive into translation issues. We are going to look at the translation of 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6, where Paul writes, I have planted, Apollos has watered, but God has caused the growth or given the increase. I have my cup of tea, and by the end, we may need an oxygen tank, but here we go. So the simplest translation has been for many years, I have planted, Paul to the church at Corinth, which he founded, as you know, perhaps from Acts chapter 18. I have planted, Apollos has watered, but God has given the increase. Now, some translations, unfortunately, seeking to be helpful, have kind of expanded this, and they have translated this, I have planted the seed. Apollos has watered, God has given the increase. That, in my estimation, is a mistake. It actually creates a false impression in the mind of the reader. It is not the visual image that Paul would have had or his original readers would have had. They would not have visualized someone planting seed. Now, that's the short of it, and now the long of it brings us into language and how language works. So, as it turns out, in English, we have two words for that we use in agriculture. One is sowing. We sow seed. We sow oats. We sow wheat. We sow rye. The other word is plant. We plant tomato plants that we have brought home from the greenhouse. We plant trees. We plant vines that we have cut off of our existing vineyards. So we have sowing and planting. And originally, the distinction was what it is that you are putting in the ground. If you are putting seeds in the ground or on the ground, you are sowing. If you are putting existing plants in the ground, you are planting. No surprise, the noun is a plant, the verb is to plant. You plant a plant in the ground. That was the original distinction. Turns out nicely that Greek parallels that very closely. We have the word spero, which means to sow or to scatter seed. The classic, Matthew 13, the sower went out to scatter his seed. We have a different word, phuteo, which means to plant a plant. And the classic there is a man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it. He dug a cistern. He built a tower. He prepared the soil. He took the little grapevine slips and he planted them carefully in the ground. So you have sowing and planting. Sowing seeds, planting plants. Very good so far. Spero, to sow or scatter, occurs 52 times in the New Testament. And phuteo, to plant, occurs 11 times in the New Testament. And I've looked at every one of them, which is not as hard as it sounds if you have a good concordance. Phuteo, to plant, it's a word we actually have in English, neophyte. Neophyte, N-E-O-P-H-Y-T-E, neophyte. It's a beautiful Greek word, means newly planted. A neophyte is someone who's newly planted. They're just starting in their work. So there's some nice correlation between spero, to sow or scatter, and phuteo, to plant an existing plant. Everything was fine, but then English shifted. And now we distinguish sowing from planting, not based on what we are putting in the ground, seeds versus plants, But we distinguish based on the level of care. So we realized at some point that seed corn was very expensive, so we're not going to scatter it on the ground. We are going to carefully prepare a channel. We are going to drop the seeds in one at a time with a little camera to make sure they're getting where they're supposed to be, and then we're carefully burying this. So we are planting corn. So we no longer distinguish on the basis of what's going into the soil, seeds versus plants. It's now the methodology. Is it scattering or is it carefully placing? And this is where the problem comes, because now we're no longer lined up with Greek New Testament, because Greek New Testament preserves the original distinction, which is seeds are sown and plants are planted. Okay, and the wonderful test case is Matthew 13:31. A man took a mustard seed, and in Greek, he sowed it in the ground. So even though he put it in very individually, very particularly, very carefully, in Greek, he sowed it in the ground. Of course, the English translators realize that you don't use English that way, so they translate, he planted it in the ground, because in English now we distinguish between the methodology of planting, not what we're putting into the ground. So we're out of sync, which is why when any of these agricultural things, you need to be very careful and pay attention to what's happening in the Greek, what's happening in agriculture today, and how the two mesh. So back to 1 Corinthians. When Paul says, I planted, you have to ask, what was he visualizing? And he was visualizing more like the vineyard owner, the person who prepares the soil, who takes the young shoot and carefully places it in the ground and then waters it and then comes back and checks up on it. He is not visualizing a sower sowing seed. So when the translation, and as I think I mentioned earlier, 18 out of 50 get it wrong, including some very popular ones. When a translation says, I planted the seed and Apollos watered it, it's wrong. It simply doesn't work. It's not what he was thinking of. How do I know that? Well, I know it, first of all, because of the word he uses. He doesn't use the word for sowing seed. He uses the word for planting a plant. Okay? Secondly, I know it because he talks about watering it. You don't need to water a seed when you plant it. God has designed seeds so that the root goes down first and then the plant comes up. So a planted seed or sown seed, they will always have more root than plant. No farmer sows his field with oats and then waters it. You couldn't do it in the first place, but you don't need to, because God has designed seeds that way. The root goes down first before the plant comes up. A few of you remember your high school biology class where you had a little Petri dish and you put a little bean seed and the root came out first and went down, and then you turned the Petri dish and that root that's now pointing up turns around and goes down again, because in that seed is this miraculous knowledge of where the center of the earth is, and the root heads for the center of the earth every time. So you don't need to water the seed. A plant, on the other hand, you take a tomato plant home from the greenhouse and you tear it out of the flat it was in, or you take it out of the cell pack where the roots have become all twirled around, and so now you have a big plant with a little root. So if you plant that in the ground, you have to water it. It won't grow. I planted the tender young plant, the living plant. Apollos watered it, and God made it grow. I know that's the image in Paul's mind. because of the word he uses, the phuteo. I know it because of the logic of the case. You water something that's planted, not something that's a seed that is sown. And I know it thirdly because the primary agricultural product in Corinth, they have some grain there, but the primary agricultural product there is raisins, grapevines, right? Okay, and citrus, which is from trees. So vines and trees, you plant them, and then you have to water them. So what's the exegetical payoff? Well, I part of it's just understanding more accurately what Paul said and what he was visualizing, but partly also to think about his ministry. He did some scattering of the seed. You know, in Acts chapter 14, he's preaching there in South Central Asia, and he's preaching to a large group of people, and he doesn't know them all personally. And in Acts chapter 17 on the Areopagus, he's preaching to a large group of people. It's a very legitimate thing to do. It's a parallel of Matthew 13. The sower went out to sow his seed. I've seen the pictures of Billy Graham, and maybe you have too. June 1973. He preached to 1.1 million people at one time with the help of his translator, Billy Kim. He was scattering the seed to 1.1 million people all at the same time. He didn't know the individual things they were facing. He knew the general condition of the human heart, and he just tossed the word out there. And that's a very legitimate thing to do. But that's not what Paul was doing most of the time. Most of the time he was planting tender young plants and nurturing them. He was talking to Lydia and her household and baptizing them. The Philippian jailer and his household, talking to them right where they were, knowing their needs and their issues, and then speaking the gospel to them. And then after he's released from prison, he goes back to encourage them. He leaves Timothy there. He leaves Silas there to nurture that young church. And then writes back to them. Of course, we call it Philippians, right? So it's a tender young plant that's being watered and nurtured after being carefully, thoughtfully planted in that place. And that's much closer to what we are called to do most of the time. In our neighborhoods, we get to know our neighbors. We get to know our friends. When we speak a word to them, it's not a general word, it's a specific word of encouragement or appreciation for what they did, or how can I help you? It's planting. It's not scattering. I mean, scattering's okay, right? Billy Graham was great, but that's not what we're called to do most of the time. We're called to plant intentionally, thoughtfully. As a parent, you plant truth in the hearts of your kids, and you water it with your prayers and sometimes with your tears. As a Sunday school teacher, as a boss at work, most of the time we're called to planting. So I really like to have Paul say, I planted. And if you need to expand that a little bit, say, I planted the tender young plant. But Apollos watered it, and God made it grow. Please don't have Paul say, I planted the seed, because they didn't do that. It's not what he was saying. He was planting a tender young plant to nurture and to pray over and to let God increase it. So, okay. Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you